Good morning, everyone, and welcome to First Draft, where I talk with journalists and authors about their important work and the stories behind them. I'm Susan Demas, the executive editor here at Lincoln Square. New York City Mayor Zoran Mamdani has been working to prove something that many people thought was impossible, showing that government can actually work for the people. Last week, he announced that in less than 200 days in office, he had balanced the city's budget, eliminating a $12 billion deficit down to zero. Joining us to talk about this and so much more that's going on in the Empire State is Audrey Kemp, who covers politics, immigration, labor, housing, and healthcare for Courier News's brand new New York outlet. Audrey, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me, Susan. It's an honor.
Great. Well, I know that your outlet just launched on May 4th, so it's brand new, but it looks like you've really hit the ground running. And let's talk a little bit about Mayor Mamdani, because he really has hit the ground running, running New York City, and he certainly has his critics, but regardless of how they may feel, eliminating such a huge budget deficit is a massive accomplishment. And that's something that a lot of local officials struggle with, especially with some of the uncertainty that we're facing in the economy nationwide. So can you talk about how this process went down and how he was able to do that?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you alluded to, he just, announced that he closed a $12 billion budget that he inherited from Eric Adams. And his strategy there was by taxing the rich, which of course is sometimes at odds with the establishment in our own state. But he's been able to do that, and he plans to continue to tax the rich to fund childcare programs, housing, healthcare, et cetera, here in the state. It's been an absolute sprint, right? Because he's been able to do this in just the 6 months that he's been in office. He also plans to fund city-run grocery stores, the first of which launched just this week. So he obviously had very ambitious plans on the campaign trail. Seemed like rhetoric at the time, but now it's delivery, right? We're in the results phase. And to come right out of the gate, clearing a $12 billion budget deficit, I think speaks for itself. Speaks for itself.
Yeah. So his solution was to tax the rich. Obviously, billionaires are not big fans of that. And you're seeing a huge backlash to a ballot initiative in California that would impose a wealth tax. What's been the response in New York, and how has the mayor responded to that criticism?
It's a really good question. So by and large, Zoran doesn't exist in a vacuum. There are several progressive candidates in office that come from the Democratic Socialists of America that propagate this tax the rich campaign, whether it be Claire Valdez or Kristen Gonzalez, right? He has a lot of allies, Chiose, in office already that support this tax the rich platform to invest wealth that is, according to them, concentrated at the top down into different programs to improve the standard of living for residents. However, right, of course, there's Hochul, there's the ultra wealthy, there's the establishment here. There are the power brokers that hold that wealth here in the state. And the general fear, right, that their wealth is going to be taken away is palpable. There's a fear that the wealthy are going to flee the state, and with them, jobs and opportunities will also flee, right? Because they're ultimately the ones who own capital, who own employers or are employers. And so that tension is very present. However, Zoran wants to meet them where they are. We see him working with venture capitalists. We see him working with figures like, the Bloombergs of the state. And so he's really trying to collaborate with them and try to, quell some of their fears and anxieties that, we can achieve a lot together, right? We can
Mm-hmm.
meet the needs of New Yorkers, and that ultimately improves everyone, and it improves our state and improves our economy. So he's really trying to make the case for that, as well as his peers and allies in office.
Yeah. And we saw how effectively he was able to neutralize and even charm President Trump in the Oval Office several months ago. Talk to us about that dynamic, because there have been a number of politicians who have not been as successful on the Democratic side in tangling with Trump. And actually, the fact that Mamdani was able to get Trump to almost be a fanboy over him was really weird to see.
Indeed, it really was. I don't think anyone could have predicted that meeting to go as well as it did, especially because Zoran has been on the record calling Trump a fascist.
Right.
And he says it confidently. At the same time, I think in the same way that he is working with, the NYPD is working with the ultra wealthy power brokers of our state, right? He understands that you have to collaborate, you have to work diplomatically, even if you might not agree with them on every front, right? And so it's been very interesting to see Zoran being able to charm President Trump. And I think, he also said that was strategic because he wants to protect the vulnerable communities in New York, but especially the immigrant communities that make up New York. And New York is one of the most diverse, if not the most diverse city in the whole country, the whole world, the whole country. And so, he really does have to extend an olive branch in order to keep New Yorkers safe.
Mm-hmm. And, he's proven to be a really skilled politician where he and Governor Kathy Hochul, who is a big moderate, they have endorsed each other. They have worked well together. Can you talk about how that alliance came about? And does this prove that the gulf between the moderate and the progressive wings of the Democratic Party can actually be bridged?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the most predominant way in which they've been able to collaborate is through the budget, right? Because I think Zoran himself was an assembly member prior to becoming the mayor. And so he is well aware of how the establishment works and how to collaborate with them to pass, more progressive measures in order to serve his constituents at the time and now all of New York City. So they have to work together. They have to collaborate together, whether it's on climate, on housing, on childcare, on healthcare. And so they have been able to work together. Hochul is a little bit more of a pragmatist, right? And Mamdani is more of idealist isn't the word, right? Because he's actually implementing what he's promising, but he is certainly ambitious in what government can provide New Yorkers. So their alliance is, I think, very promising, and I think it's very necessary in order to get his agenda across and achieved. Yeah.
Right. Well, you mentioned that he has earlier this week, he announced the first publicly operated grocery store, which was a big campaign promise for him. And this is a really big undertaking. And I think some people probably thought it was just rhetoric, but he is actually implementing it because there are so many neighborhoods in New York that don't have a grocery store. And that is a huge problem for people who are facing this massive affordability crisis in the country. So I know you've done some reporting on this. Talk to us about what this is going to look like in practice.
Absolutely. So earlier this week, I traveled up to the South Bronx. And it's very interesting. The location that he chose was a former juvenile detention center. So it's really a reclamation of a place with, a dark, sad history, bringing something that is positive to a community that really needs it. The Bronx in particular is really underserved. By and large, it is considered a food desert, although, so much of the resources of that neighborhood is extrapolated elsewhere, right? Like they feed the rest of the city, but by and large, that borough is underserved. And so I think, Zoran actually delivering on that promise, announcing that he's going to, open the first city-run grocery store in the most underserved borough of New York City is genuinely super heartening. And it was a pleasure to cover. And this is, of course, like the first of 5 that he's going to unveil across the city.
Mhm.
And it's very interesting. So in practice, of course, that's going to be powered by unions. Unions were very well represented at, the announcement, because according to Mamdani, he said in his remarks that unions are one of the strongest solutions to addressing inequality that working people face. So it's going to be powered by union power. And of course, it's going to be funded again by public funds, which is why the relationship between Zoran and Governor Hochul is so vital, right, in getting this agenda across. It's just one of many examples of Mamdani and his vision to serve the people of New York, serve everyday New Yorkers.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's going to be very interesting to watch. It opens in 2027.
So much of what you have to do as a mayor, as a local official, is, taking care of just those bread and butter issues for your constituents. And, we all saw him get out there, with a snow shovel when New York was hit by, a huge snowstorm. He's talked a lot about fixing the roads. And that's the kind of thing that you hear from politicians, across the spectrum in the Democratic Party, at least, moderates, progressives, everybody needs to try and, make sure that we can all get to work one way or another. But what seems to distinguish Zoran from a lot of politicians is he has kind of learned the lesson, maybe something that Trump has mastered, that you can't just do good. You can't just implement policies. You need to tell people how you're doing it. You need to basically sell them on it. And that's something that I think former President Biden did not do very effectively with things like, the IRA. And a lot of people, may have benefited, but they didn't know that money was coming from the government. Maybe they thought that it was the Republican congressman who took credit for it. And, he was the one who was delivering those jobs in the district and fixing the roads. So you talk with us because, I think you can reduce it down to like, look, Zoran's really good on Instagram and TikTok, and that, sure, he has charisma, but he seems to have tapped into something that would be really beneficial for Democrats across the country to really connect with people.
Yeah, absolutely. His, like you alluded to, his social strategy has been very effective. I think the candid nature of his delivery, right, his message is very approachable, and it gets people who wouldn't otherwise be maybe civically engaged to listen. And that is very resonant with Courier Newsroom's mission as well, right? We aim to explain to everyday people why you should pay attention to policy, why you should pay attention to who represents you in Albany, right? Because those are the people who vote on your rent. Those are the people who vote on your schools. And Zoran has been, delivering that repeatedly on the campaign trail, right? Freeze the rent, fast and free buses, right? He's doing that translation work for everyday New Yorkers. And I think that is the piece of the puzzle that makes his technique so successful and so effective, because, I think jargon can be lost on, everyday working people who might not be as plugged in. They might not be reading city and state. They might not understand what policy looks like. And he's making them less abstract and making them real for people. And I think that's why his campaign has been so resonant. And also, like you alluded to, he's filling 100,000 potholes in his first 100 days. I mean, he's really delivering on those things and making politics a real tangible reality for people to understand.
Right. Yeah, I know so much of the reporting that you and other reporters do at Courier is aimed at making sure that people who may not want to read your article, still get good information, whether they're on Instagram or TikTok. And I know you've done some really powerful reporting on the historic testimony of Epstein survivors in Albany in your state house last week. I think we have some of your reporting, and just wanted to give a trigger warning for the content.
Corinne Silva. I'm a victim and survivor of Jeffrey Epstein sex trafficking. I'm here today, but it took me a lifetime to be able to speak about what happened to me. I live in Queens, New York. I'm a very hardworking single mom and proud of how far I came. I met Jeff Epstein in 2001. I was told I could give him a massage to make money. No one ever told me it was going to be sexual. He bullied me into sexual acts with him. I was just 17 years old at that time, a child. He asked me to undress and touched me. I was scared, confused, and didn't know what to think. He abused me after that again until he told my friend that I was too brown, too dark. I was really hurt by what Epstein did to me.
So that was testimony from Corinne De Silva, and this was her first time testifying about the abuse that she suffered due to Jeffrey Epstein, like so many women. We've covered a number of the hearings on Capitol Hill, but can you talk with us about how this hearing in Albany came about?
Yeah, absolutely. And so there's actually a package of bills that these Epstein survivors are fighting for that would allow them to sue his estate. And, it's actually quite amazing because prior to this, this package, there are no laws that allow victims of human trafficking to sue for punitive damages. And so these very brave women testified before the New York State Senate for the very first time. And as you saw in that clip, the trauma is very present. It's an ever-present part of their life. And they're really pushing for this legislation to be passed. And what isn't actually visible in those clips is listening to different lawmakers, different, Democrats in office, and the way that they are so gracious to hear the testimony of these survivors. And they're really trying to pass this legislation so that there's not only justice for these survivors, but, future victims of human trafficking. It's really the first of its kind legislation. And to hear those accounts was very harrowing, but it also really localizes, not only like the national scandal, right? But it transforms scandal into policy. Like there's something that we can do about this phenomenon. And especially here in New York, right? Which used to be Epstein's playground, right? He had that mansion in the Upper East Side on 71st Street. It really does localize this story.
Right. Well, we know that the Trump Department of Justice clearly is not interested in pursuing any justice for victims. They've been stonewalling at the national level, and they have refused to follow the law that was passed, the bipartisan Epstein Transparency Act, and withheld about $3 million documents. And so now a lot of survivors are looking at states like New York or New Mexico to try and find justice. What would you say is the likelihood that this package will pass?
Oh, it's very hard to say. I think there are some folks in power who would very much not like it to pass. We even had Melania Trump declare that she had no connections to Epstein. So I think there will be resistance, But telling these stories and providing a platform, right, for bills of this nature is really what it's all about. This is why Courier does what it does, is to provide a platform for stories like this that matter. I, of course, hope that these bills pass. It's just all about rallying support, and garnering support for this kind of legislation. Of course, the battle continues in Albany.
Yeah. So Democrats control the assembly. Is there some resistance from Democrats, or is it mostly coming from the Republican side?
Not that I'm aware of, but that could be a really interesting follow-up story.
Yeah, because obviously there are so many powerful people who were part of this nefarious web that Epstein weaved. And, as we found, there have been many powerful people in Trump's orbit, but there are bipartisan enablers of Epstein, as we've seen from the Obama and Clinton eras as well. So I know that even though Epstein's crimes were kind of an open secret amongst the rich for many years, you never saw any move in states like New Mexico or New York up to this point to do anything about it. And it really took phenomenal reporting of Julie Brown down in Florida before anything happened there. So that's why, the reporting that you do is so critical, to help try and get justice, especially when we're not seeing that at the federal level. And so where are we at in this process? Is it in committee right now?
Yes, it's my understanding that it is in committee. And, there's a lot of momentum to spread awareness, right? Here in New York, the Epstein reading rooms opened in New York City. So there's a lot of, I think, everyday people who want to see justice, and that certainly helps.
Absolutely. Well, I know that obviously a lot of blue cities have been targets of ICE, and New York has a vibrant immigrant population that contributes so much. Are you expecting to see things ramp up, especially as we're getting into summer and this is an election year?
Yeah, unfortunately, we have seen an uptick in ICE activity, especially here in New York City. I went to cover a rally hosted by Brooklyn Borough President Antonio Reynoso, alongside City Council member Sandy Nurse. Sandy Nurse was actually a witness to an ICE raid at Wyckoff Hospital that, involved a young man being dragged out of the hospital. So unfortunately, there has been an uptick in activity, a targeting of our immigrant communities here in the city. At the same time, it is very heartening to see some of our elected officials fighting back in that case. And also Brad Lander, who is running in the 10th district. I met with him at 26 Federal Plaza because he's been showing up to immigration for over a year now. It was actually where he himself was arrested, to bear witness to ICE agents who essentially camp outside of immigration court, which is very nefarious when you think about it. These are immigrants who are going through the legal channels. They're showing up to court, right, to navigate the immigration system here in the United States. And, he's witnessed family separations time and time again. He's witnessed, sometimes violent arrests in these immigration courts. What's really interesting about that story is on Monday, a federal judge actually ruled that they can't do that. However, Lander is actually showing up to immigration court today because ICE, at least from what I've heard from my sources, is still showing up, essentially ignoring this ruling. So I think that the chances of ICE activity continuing are high, even though New York is doing everything it can to protect its immigrant communities. As you alluded to, I mean, New York has always been a city of immigrants, right? We used to have Klein Deutschland in the Lower East Side. We have Brighton Beach. We have, all of whom are like Russian immigrants. We have so many different immigrant diasporas that make up New York. And so it's certainly a very sensitive topic. And I hope to continue to cover that fight and the people who are trying to protect those communities, because it's very much an ongoing story.
Yeah. Yeah, let's talk a little bit about Brad Lander, because he was one of the many candidates who ran for mayor last year and joined forces with Mamdani against, it was kind of a anybody but Cuomo campaign. And it was really unique to see politicians that tend not to play well with one another do that and form alliances. And I'm sure with what we're seeing with the California governor's race, that a lot of people would like to see that over there. But he's a really fascinating person. I know he spent some time in Minneapolis during just the lawless ICE raids there, and talking with people on the ground about what they were facing and trying to help there. What do you see for his future in New York?
Yeah, he is a very fascinating figure indeed. Obviously, he has an activist background. He's been arrested several times, just engaging in civil disobedience. And then, of course, he was the comptroller of New York City. And, now he's running in the 10th district against incumbent Dan Goldman. And, I had this very same question for him when I was on the ground with him at 26 Federal Plaza. And what's very interesting is he was clearly very, rightfully shaken by the killings of Renee Good and Alex Pretty in Minneapolis. And he wants to see real accountability. He wants to see the agents who killed these citizens at a hearing. He wants real accountability. And that's what he sees lacking in what Dan Goldman has been able to provide. Although, Dan Goldman has passed or has tried to, mitigate ICE activity through, various bills. Lander wants to take it a step further. He wants the real hearings to be in New York City, and he wants to see accountability in a more tangible way.
Well, I know that you've done some May Day coverage, and it seems like there have been some really key links between the labor community and the immigrant rights community. Can you talk with us a little bit about those relationships and how they may be helpful against, future onslaughts from the Trump administration?
That's a really interesting question. Yes, and so I was on the ground at Washington Square Park to cover May Day, which had a presence of, I think, over 60 labor unions. And as Zoran previously said, he considers organized labor to be one of the biggest solutions to inequality that, impacts working people. In the past, we've seen, different labor unions fight for racial equality, fight for gender equality. And by the same token, we can absolutely, I think, expect to see general strikes in response to ICE raids, for example. Like we've just seen, one of the first general strikes in 90 years happened earlier this year. So organized labor, especially in the city of New York, is proving itself to be one of the strongest tools that working people have, right? And of course, immigrants comprise a large, I guess, proportion of those unions. When I was on the ground speaking with union workers, a lot of them were immigrants themselves and firmly believe in the power of banding together, right? And so that's been very heartening to cover, and especially in in the wake of all of this ICE activity. So it'll certainly be an area that I'll be watching. I'll be paying a lot of attention to.
Can we expect to see that New York will join this redistricting arms race that's been going on across the country? I know that there are some interesting dynamics in state politics there, and so far we have not seen kind of the aggressive gerrymandering there that we have in some other states.
Yeah, thankfully, I mean, it's been very concerning to see what's, like what the Supreme Court passed, like in Virginia, and the attacks on the Voting Rights Act, all of which Courier has been covering very closely for people to understand. In the case of New York, I have received a couple of tips from sources about what some upstate Republicans are trying to do, at least in the way of ranked choice voting. And this is all very premature. I hope to do some more reporting on this, but I did receive a tip that some Republicans are trying to utilize ranked choice voting in a petition that would essentially take party lines off of ballots, which is concerning, right? Because that's
a step further than traditional ranked choice voting. That's
right.
Kind of giving people less information.
Exactly. That's exactly what they're doing. So whereas like ranked choice voting was something brought forth by progressives down here in New York City, right? It was more like a democratic measure. They're trying to utilize it in a way or manipulate it in a way that would give voters, like you said, less information, less access to what candidates are running on what party. So that's a developing story. Stay tuned for more there. That is certainly concerning. The redistricting and gerrymandering trend phenomenon that's happening across the country is certainly pretty concerning. So I'll be watching that, and I'll be reporting on any developments there. So stay tuned for more.
Great. Well, I know that you have not been digging into too many of the hot congressional primaries that are coming up very soon in your state, but certainly the New York 12th race has gotten a lot of national attention. Congressman Jerry Nadler is retiring, and there is a really crowded primary with some big names like George Conway, who used to be a longtime Republican, Jack Schlossberg, who of course is a Kennedy, and has a lot of name recognition there, and several other more local politicians that are running. Can you just give us the broad strokes and what the dynamics are in that race? Because this is really one of the wealthiest districts in the country, and has gotten a lot of attention well beyond New York.
Yes, absolutely. As you alluded to, this is the wealthiest congressional district in the country, and I would consider it a proxy war for the future of the Democratic Party, right? With Jerry Nadler's open seat, there are some really interesting figures coming forth, right? Yes, Schlossberg is not only endorsed by Nancy Pelosi, but he's running like a high energy social media campaign to, like you said, revive kind of like the Kennedy legacy. At the same time, we have Alex Boris running, who has somewhat of a different background. He has a background in computer science, and as an assembly member, he co-authored the RAISE Act to regulate AI. And I'm speaking with him actually this afternoon. The coverage of the congressional races are coming soon, I promise you. With the June primary coming up on the 23rd, we will be covering all of those in earnest. But I'm actually speaking with Alex Boris this afternoon about the AI industry, dark money, crypto, and AI titans that are like flooding this race, specifically to stop him because he wants to regulate them. He wants to regulate AI. So he's kind of going up against some of the most powerful figures in the political landscape today, which is very interesting. And at the same time, you have some more like institutionalists like Michael Lasher, who was backed by Bloomberg. He kind of represents that traditional New York City power structure. And so it'll be really interesting, that race in particular, to dig into like the tech money angle.
Yeah.
I think the real question.
We've seen that the tech oligarchs have been playing on a lot of primaries on the Democratic side this year. So that's a really interesting dynamic.
Yeah, especially, with Palantir being such, a controversial company, and it's meddling in our political system in more ways than one. Yeah,
absolutely. Well, Audrey, I understand that in addition to all the time that you spend reporting on issues impacting New Yorkers, you're also teaching civics, and you're informing the public how to register to vote or how they can connect with legislators. So can you talk with us, because that's definitely different than just reporting on the news.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that's what we would kind of consider to be like service journalism, to get everyday people to understand the deadlines they need to know, how to properly register, how to make sure that you're able to participate in the primary. And so those are kind of laying the foundation for our coverage of the House races to come, just to make sure that, constituents know that they're not, going to show up to a polling place and be sent away. So yeah, I mean, essentially, because we're such a new newsroom, I was basically stockpiling our content with more evergreen content that's helpful to voters before we get into like the nitty gritty, like we alluded to, like the tension and the drama of some of these congressional races.
Well, that's great.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, there is no shortage of information these days, but there is a shortage of good practical information and how to just find those basics out there. Like, where is my polling place? Has my district changed? Because, we seem to be redistricting every other week. So it's great that you can be a font of information like that for readers, where they know this is a trusted place that they can go.
Thank you.
So Audrey, can you tell us what is the best way that people can find your work?
Well, certainly our website, courierny.com. Yeah, we're a fairly new website, but there are already, I think, north of 15 stories that I've published in a matter of weeks on there. And of course, subscribing to our newsletter so you can get the rundown of everything I've been up to that week, as well as what, other outlets in the ecosystem are running that are worthy of your reading. So yeah, I would say certainly the website, certainly the newsletter. And then of course, as you alluded to earlier, social media. Courier Newsroom is a social first, civically engaged newsroom, values-driven newsroom. So we really do try to distill the information that we develop in more ways than one, that are, going to reach as many people as possible. So we do leverage, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube as well. But of course, I also certainly want to plug the website as a long form magazine writer. I think, not only do I enjoy writing long, but, we have amazing other state newsrooms, many talented journalists on staff. So I would always plug the website and the newsletter as well.
Great. Audrey, thank you so much for spending time with us today. And I hope that you'll come back and talk with us as some of these primaries evolve, and we're looking ahead to the midterms as well.
I would absolutely relish that, Susan. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.